I will give the floor to Alexandra to introduce all of our board members. It's very nice to see you all. And yes, Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thibault. Thank you for the opportunity to moderate today's panel. It's our last discussion of the conference, so it's a great privilege to contribute to the public discussion of Computational Antitrust Board. In our discussion, we will look on the horizon. Hence, first, we will reflect on the state of play of computational antitrust, and then we will come up with a research plan that would allow us to measure the success of computational antitrust. I am thrilled to welcome today's speakers, Professor Bill Kovacic, Professor Michał Gał, Professor Jonathan Askin, and last but not least, Professor Daniel Crane. Our first speaker is Professor Bill Kovacic, who is a global competition professor of law and policy at the George Washington University Law School. Professor Michał Gał is a professor and director of the Center for Law and Technology at the Faculty of Law at the University of Haifa in Israel. Professor Daniel Crane is Frederick Paul Firth Senior Professor of Law at the University of Michigan. And finally, Professor Jonathan Askin is the founder and the director of the Brooklyn Law Incubator and Policy Clinic at the Brooklyn Law School. Let me remind our participants that they are very welcome to ask questions in the Q&A section. I hope to address them at the end of the panel if we won't monopolize the floor too much. And I hope you all had a chance to follow Scott's fascinating keynote, because to kick off the discussion, I would like to ask you about your reaction to his presentation. For all of those who could not be there with us for the keynote, Scott talked about platform competition in a Web3 future, in contrast to Web2, where data is stored on the platform and user might not be able to extract it. On Web3, the user controls all of data, which is stored on a wallet that represents his or her assets. All those assets are stored on a public blockchain, which makes them portable and which creates an opportunity and an incentive for platforms to specialize and compete. And with this brief summary of Scott's presentation, I would like to ask Bill first to share his comments on this. Bill, what's that Scott's keynote mean from computational antitrust perspective? I'm sorry, but you're on mute, so we cannot hear you.
Thanks very much for the chance to participate. And Thibault wasn't exaggerating. Scott's presentation was brilliant and far-sighted. To me, one of its main implications is that it underscores the ability, again, and the importance for the institutions that implement the law being able to look over the horizon and to understand developments that are coming their way, to see current activities in a broader context, and to engage in the exercise that Scott was suggesting about imagining what the future is going to look like and asking whether or not you have a program in place that's flexible, adaptable, and anticipates that. So on the one hand, I find it exciting and delightful as a way of thinking about policymaking, thinking about the framework in which public institutions that work in the tech area and have regulatory responsibilities ought to think about their job. But it also gives me an element of despair, because I'm afraid that the institutional arrangements that permit that kind of forward-looking have received far too little attention in our thinking about policymaking. The development of the capabilities lags way behind where they should be. And we have a long way to go to put ourselves in a position to take advantage of the insights and imagination that Scott brings to the process. I think we'll get later to some ideas about how we try to do that on a better scale. So it's invigorating to see this vision of the future. It's a bit dispiriting to think about the ability of the relevant institutions in the public sector acting as they do now to do this in an effective way.
Thank you for your insight. Michał, do you agree with Bill? What's your take?
I always agree with Bill. Wonderful. I agree with both parts of Bill's answer. I find it fascinating. I find it invigorating. But at the same time, I am wondering what is really going to be different with Web.3 if we don't apply what we learned from mistakes regarding interoperability with regard to Web.2. Because and let me give you some things that arose when I thought about the presentation. So one of them is that the user characters might not be very different from human being entering different websites. So the fact itself that we have control over who we are, whether it is virtual or real, doesn't change then so much the dynamic, or need not change so much the dynamic. Another thing is that I wonder what the data that we're going to carry in our virtual wallet is going to be about. Because if it's only about us and it's data that we created about ourselves, then we can actually probably control it and it would be ours. But what happens if our virtual self changes as a result of interaction with others on a certain platform? Would that be then, would these changes be stored in our digital wallet or by the platform? Or if I have different interactions with other virtual images and I want to store them or I want to continue them, go to sleep and then come back, who stores this? Who owns it? Is it the person, or is it the platform? My own feeling is that the platform would probably want to store it by itself, and that would give it some power, probably a lot of power over users, creating the network effect. So I love the idea and I love the presentation, but I worry that if we do not address these problems, we're going to be in the same situation that we are in today with regard to interoperability.
Thank you. Jonathan, do you agree? So are you also concerned about the data ownership and the platform, the power that it might confer on the platform?
So I vehemently agree. Let me give a little bit of, first of all, Scott put me on an emotional roller coaster. The biggest problem and the biggest hurdle and the thing we always forget and every new generation doesn't remember is the interconnection issues that plagued the generation preceding it. That is something that we haven't been able to overcome, and it's only going to get worse in the future. Let me give you a couple examples. First, I mean, remember when telecom first started 150 years ago? There was ferocious competition. We forget that in the days before AT&T rolled up the telecommunications network in America, at least. And it took, every 40 years or so, it took antitrust regulators to take a very heavy hand against the growing monopolist. I see no reason why we're not going to experience the same issue and even bigger problems with mandatory interconnection. This is a tough month for us to be talking about the value of, the Pollyannish utopian value of technology in the wake of FTX and the crypto collapse. But I should tell you, I'm a sucker for any utopian pitch. So part of me was definitely won over. I was a young FCC staffer back in 1996. And we all thought the Telecom Act in America had just been passed. We thought we were writing rules that had never existed before. We thought everything was going to be easy. We didn't realize all the fits and starts that we were going to be going through then. There was one day, I wrote a fake order on something called email address portability. I thought it was absurd that you couldn't take your AOL account and move it over to CompuServe. That's the only stickiness that CompuServe and AOL and the others had against the world, was the stickiness of their email address. If you could port it, that would be great. Everyone thought that was absurd. There was no way you should be able to take your email address and port it over to another carrier. So it was a joke that I think proved the problem, at least at that stage in pre-Web 1. I think the problem is right now, we are stuck in a world where we've got almost no regulatory oversight of the disembodied internet platforms. We've got less and less oversight over the internet access providers, any of the transmission media. We do not have ubiquitous broadband. You still need to go through some gatekeeper somewhere. And now we live in a global environment where everyone can move to the most laissez-faire jurisdiction possible without any restrictions. So I think we've got this dilemma, and we've seen it over and over again. We see this period of regulation in which the regulators step in when they recognize there's excessive control by one market power. And at some point, we think there's excessive regulation. We abandon the regulatory model, which we've certainly done in America. It's interesting to see all the EU folks speaking over the past 3 days, because the EU has taken, I think, a much stronger stance on regulation and antitrust. We are starting to see in America, now that we've largely abdicated regulatory oversight, we're starting to see movement on the antitrust front. What I was doing in 1996 at the FCC, now the FTC is trying to do it in the Web3 world. They have fewer sticks and fewer carrots to lay out before the industry now. I don't know how they're going to do it without statutory authority, and certainly without global statutory authority. I think we're going to be largely reliant on the goodwill, at least the near-term goodwill, of all of the platforms, and the hope that they think they've, at least in the near term, got to stave off regulation, got to stave off the antitrust oversight, and will enter into at least good actor practices, maybe global memoranda of understanding. But I think once this snowballs and once they gain more and more control over the users, over the network, we are never going to see the Pollyannish dream of avatar or data portability. So I think that's our dilemma. And this, I think it's essential for us in this discussion and for the Stanford computational antitrust folks to grapple with that almost insurmountable problem.
Thank you, Jonathan. Daniel, can I ask you about your comments on Scott's presentation, also what Jonathan and Bill and Michal said before?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks very much for including me in this program. Like the other commentators, I was intrigued by Scott's presentation. I found it sort of lifted my spirits to kind of imagine this world of data stored in your personal crypto wallet. All the data is freely portable. All the agency is in the owner of the data, and it's all sort of self-policing and self-perpetuated through the power of blockchain. This is kind of the Schumpeterian answer to the power of big tech. The technology will solve the problem. The creative destruction will come from a sort of an inevitable shift towards the empowerment of the individual. And it really sort of solves all these problems that we were concerned about with respect to stickiness of big tech power. But I think, like everyone else, then the question is like, well, what could go wrong with this story? And, like Bill mentioned, are the institutions up to it? Like my first worry is, are the institutions going to get in the way of it? I mean, the history of, Jonathan talks about the history of telecom regulation, and, I don't see the history of telecom regulation or regulation more generally as, the government always wearing the white hat and trying to facilitate competition. Like lots of the story of telecom or anything else is the story of governments getting in the way of processes that empower individuals, right? And then, so beyond those institutions and governmental regulators, I worry about the response of companies that have a vested interest in stopping this from happening, right? Who don't want to see free portability, who want to propertize things in ways that make them rich. And so what are their counter strategies to this kind of Schumpeterian wave? And so, as someone who kind of accepts the Schumpeterian story, like up to a point, you also have to take into account, though, the counter strategies, the responses, people who want to thwart this from happening, and how will that take place? So without, any ability to predict the future, I just say that there's a lot of optimism in the story. It's a wonderful story, and we want it to happen. And I'm just not sure whether the bigger threat is coming from the regulators or from the market actors, or it's like the synergy of them both acting together to thwart it. So those are the questions that I would have.
Thank you. So I will maybe circle back to Bill, and I wanted to build up on your experience at the FTC and the CMA, and I wanted to ask you what kind of tips would you have for antitrust agencies that would like to foster the computational antitrust capacity?
One of the things you need is a professional staff that understands what they're looking at, to do a diagnosis and assessment that might lead you in the intervention path, but as Dan is just saying, might lead you to stay out. But you need skilled analysts who understand what they're seeing, and I'd say there's an epidemic failure in the larger field to assemble those teams. I know of one agency in the world in the competition area that's done that, or has had success in doing it. That's the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK. What they did 5 years ago is to say, how can we operate in this domain if we don't have deep technical expertise that goes beyond the abilities of lawyers and economists? And over a 5-year period, they've made an investment that has built a group of 50 people, computer scientists, physicists, engineers, quants, so that they can participate in the policy discussion and analysis in a way that gives them the ability to understand what's going on. Most lawyers I know have been running away from mathematics since they were in high school. There are a few exceptions, but not all that many. And I think that the CMA builds the first important load-bearing structure, which is to say, do we have the right people to do this work? Now, I'll say in a moment, you can contract out for that, but I don't see how you do it unless you have an internal organic capacity to do it. I think other agencies are seeing what the CMA has done and realizing, my God, we've missed this, and they're doing a bit of catching up. But that's step one. Step two is you need a research agenda that looks outside your own walls and tries to anticipate, understand some of the phenomena that Scott was talking about, but also has the ability to understand the evolution of these systems over time, has made an investment in learning about what you did before and what you want to do again, what you don't want to do again. Here again, the CMA, using its market studies regime, has done a nice job deciding we're going to invest in understanding what's happened in the sector and how it's developed. I guess the last element is that you need an ongoing, extensive program of consultations with a whole variety of academic disciplines, of industry participants. You have on your own, you've got to be going to the kinds of events at which Scott speaks, and so many others who do the imagining of the future. You have to convene events where you bring these people in to talk to you, and you don't do it every 5 years. You do it on a regular, ongoing basis. And because you're probably not going to get the money to do it on your own, you desperately need collaborative relationships with academic hubs on the outside. You have to do more than simply recruit students, recruit faculty, recruit participants. You need to recognize this body of centers of learning on the outside as being an indispensable co-producer for what you're doing, and to engage them more directly. An alternative is to build the agency so that it has its own capability, but we don't want to do that. We don't want to pay for it. So I think you have to look for ways to draw that in from the outside, and to develop the role of the intervener, of the convener of events that puts you in a position to do this. And I think in doing that, you increase the capacity of the institutions to understand what's taking place, to understand how you got there, almost in a wargaming-like way that takes place in the military sciences. You start to imagine alternative paths. You say, where could this go? What would get in the way of it taking another path? What could upset that from taking place? And you put yourself in a much better position to look ahead. And I'd say, finally, everything I'm talking about is investment rather than consumption. This all involves making investments now that aren't going to pay off right away. And in our system of public administration, nobody wants to plant trees. Everybody wants to gather the familiar low-hanging fruit. So this means overcoming a serious problem of public administration as well to make these kinds of investments.
Thank you so much. Maybe just a follow-up, because I remember you mentioned that competition authorities should hire historians. So that's also builds up on what you said about understanding what's happening and what has happened in the past. So I was wondering whether to what extent one can bring into one room lawyers, economists, computer scientists, and historians. And how could agencies make sure that they work in a constructive way?
I think you start by understanding that all of these disciplines are relevant to what you're doing. You do have to bring in the historian. I mean, recall what Jonathan was saying about the past. An extensive body of experience. It goes back many, many years, centuries in some respect. Who understands that? How many people know what happened? And if you rely on lawyers to do it, they are going to approach history like they approach brief writing. They're going to go looking for episodes that support their priors. They're not going to give you the broader perspective on what took place. It's the equivalent of a lawyer in a law office, a senior partner that says, find me a case that says X, as opposed to saying, find me what the law says on this topic. You need that broader perspective that not only examines what's taken place in individual sectors and how they've developed, but understands what the agency's done as well, what it's done well, what it's done badly, why it's failed. And here again, you run into a political science difficulty in the US. We have an unfortunate habit of putting everything that the last set of actors did into the bonfire, and we destroy it because what is there to learn? And say we've got to build it all up from the starting point of now. That's frightfully hard to do. So you have to recognize that this multidisciplinary perspective has great potential to get you a better outcome. You need the historical perspective in the room. And you need a broader sense in our community that tells leadership, this is your job to do this. This is part of your job to do it well. Don't just tell me about how many cases you've got and how they're going, how many rules. Tell me about how you're building the capability to do this work well over time.
Thank you. Maybe next question to Michał. You argue that only a small number of cases involving algorithmic facilitated cartels have been brought by competition authorities. So my question to you is, what computational antitrust solutions should agencies develop to enhance their detection capabilities of algorithmic collusion infringements?
Well, thank you for this question. And I actually think that this area is one in which computational antitrust can assist with regard to at least some of the tasks that a regulator would have. So let me start by saying that I think that the issue of coordinated algorithmic pricing is an important one. There have been many who have written and researched the area, starting with the very important work of Maurice Ezrahi and with Maurice Stuckey and Ariel Ezrahi, sorry. And now we have, beyond the theoretical research, we have experimental research and empirical studies which show that algorithms can actually learn to coordinate even by themselves. So computational antitrust here definitely has the capacity to increase enforcement, but I think that we need to separate some cases. So where can it increase enforcement? It can increase it in those cases in which algorithms are used as tools for coordination, where in cases where algorithms are part of a hub and spoke agreement, also with coded coordination. And why is that? Because if these are, once we find them, they might be illegal. then we might use tools, computational antitrust tools, in order to detect them in the first place. It can help us separate the cases. It can help us learn more about propensities to coordinate under different conditions, and therefore maybe capture those cases that we can under what is called facilitating practices. So here they can be of much assistance. However, they might also be of assistance in the most difficult cases, in which are right now not captured under our laws, and these are the cases in which the algorithms learn by themselves to coordinate. But even in these cases, I think that studies, computational antitrust studies that show such propensities, can increase motivation to enrich our toolbox beyond what we have today. And also they might assist us in making better decisions with regard to merger review, which is one tool that we do have, which might capture such types of conduct which are not otherwise captured under our prohibitions of agreement and restraint of trade. So how would computational antitrust achieve that? It's some ways. Okay, let me give some examples. One would be experiments on how rational agents, different algorithms, would react under different market conditions. And as a result, we could learn more about what conditions actually increase coordination, and which one could be prohibited in order to fashion our remedies. We can experiment by introducing noise on either side of the market, noise on the supply side or noise on the demand side. So these are just two, and there might be more.
It sounds like fighting fire with fire. And I think it's very important to talk more about legal hackers. And Jonathan, I know that you're an originator of the international legal hacker movement. So could you please explain to us what legal hacking is and how could it benefit antitrust lawyers?
Sure. Let me start with a little story. 15 years ago, my students and I used to go to hackathons. At the time, 15 years ago, very few people even knew what a hackathon was. Essentially, no lawyers knew what a hackathon was. Certainly no legal academics or legal administrators knew what a hackathon was. So my students and I would go, and we would essentially be wallflowers at this incredibly creative revolution. We would watch for 46 hours, or while the coders and developers and web designers would do miraculous things. And then we would step in at the 46th hour and say, well, you did it all wrong. You didn't divide up your IP, you didn't figure out equity arrangements, you forgot about all these regulatory hurdles. And we were essentially the wet blanket on the fire of revolution. That was a terrible thing for lawyers to be, but that's what we taught in law school. We were issue spotters and naysayers, essentially. So we decided as a community that we were going to try to figure out how to retrain lawyers to become enablers of the hacker movement, to adopt the hacker ethos, the hacker spirit, and figure out the role for lawyers in this ecosystem. The problem still exists. We've got huge problems in legal education, and we've got problems in policy education. We are not training lawyers and policymakers to understand the trajectory of technology. So to the extent we even have successful hackathons or legal hackathons, for the most part, they've been isolated moments. We're stuck in our own little echo chamber, and very little lives on beyond what we do in those weekend bursts. So I think what is important, and this also applies to the relationship of the lawyer in the AI world. I think we've got to figure out how lawyers and policymakers become partners with AI, partners with technologists, and become essentially now an ethical overlay, a curator of what the technologists are throwing at us. I used to run an event in DC every year called the Peripheral Visionary Summit. And at the Peripheral Visionary Summit, we would essentially lock all the policymakers in the room and bring in all the futurists we could find to DC and tell them what the future could be if they wrote the rules this way, if they wrote the rules that way. Even in those early days, however, those talks, those hackathons were essentially talkathons. We talk around the issue. It was very difficult to memorialize anything. We've started to see new iterations of that, where, at least in the legal hacker movement, we've got now some communication globally, the ability to now have virtual hackathons where there is communication across chapters, and we're sort of building upon the genius that came before, instead of all reinventing the wheel in our own little hackathon silo. So I guess when I first went to the FCC, I was incredibly Pollyannish, and I would believe everything that the technologists would come to say to us, that the lawyers and lobbyists would come to say to us. One little trick we had there was tell the lawyers and lobbyists to leave the room. Leave us with the technologists. They can tell us what's going on. And then we could, they tend to be a lot more honest, the technologists and the engineers, than the lawyers and lobbyists. In any event, I don't think we're seeing the full fruits. We're starting to see the US government, in Obama, they were tiptoeing into the concept of government hackathons. Health and Human Services did it early on during when they were establishing Obamacare. The White House Office of Science and Tech Policy started to do hackathons. As a tool to inform government, it works quite well. And I'll tell you the other trick for this. If government could engage in hackathons, they will be doing something, I think, more important than any fruit that comes out of the hackathon. They will be engaging the community that otherwise would not participate. Right now, government, the regulatory bodies, are largely captive to big business. Very few people are speaking for the startups, the people, and certainly no one's really speaking for the companies that could be if the rules were written a certain way. The companies that could exist 5-10 years down the line if the rules were written that way. But no one's speaking for them because no one wants to pave the way for what could be. And in fact, we'll never know, 5 years down the line, we'll never know what could have been had we engaged the technologists and the startups and trained the lawyers and policymakers to think more in a more forward-looking manner. So in any case, I think we are essentially in legal hackathon era 1.0 still. So to the extent we move to hackathon 2.0, hackathon 3, it's still a long road for us, and we've got to be eternally vigilant.
Or here we are discussing Antitrust 3.0, so we are a little bit more advanced. I wanted to ask Daniel, because last year I remember you said that you are not an expert on computational law. And so let me ask you a question about the criminal element of antitrust, as you recently published articles on the criminalization of antitrust law. So should agencies rely on computational solutions to build cases? Do you think courts will find the evidence convincing enough to convict individuals?
So, I think when we talk about computational law or law and technology more generally, it's important to distinguish between the law of technology and the technology of law. So, we sometimes talk about legal regulation of computational technologies, and that's an important set of issues. But we can also think about the way in which computational technologies, can themselves become inputs into regulation of human behavior, whether or not that happens to be computational, right? So you could imagine data-driven, algorithmic, or computational aids to figuring out whether people in a smoke-filled room with no technology at all had engaged in price fixing, right? And so I think this question really is about to what extent can computational tools enter into the criminal antitrust space and be helpful. So I've spent far too much time the last 2 weeks watching the FIFA World Cup. And one of the sort of the interesting sociological observations is about this new offsides technology, which is automated technology. And I've seen this play out like 3 or 4 times in matches where the robot calls it offsides, and the players in the field are wildly contesting it, just like they would have if the ref had called it offsides. And then the commentators get involved. And one commentator says, "That's baloney, that wasn't offsides." The other commentator says, what are you talking about? It's the machine. The machine can't be wrong. The machine has told us it's offsides. It's offsides. Like, why are you even arguing this? And the other commentator says something like, well, I don't trust the machine. And I think it's just it's a wonderful sort of little paradigm for our attitudes towards the very human enterprise of making decisions about accountability or rules. And in the criminal space, especially, I think there's a real appetite for moral judgment to be made. So, Herbert Hovenkamp has this wonderful line he's repeated on many occasions, that antitrust has no moral content. And like that may be true about mergers. And Michal mentioned sort of using computational tools to sort of do merger simulation. I think that'd be a really beneficial set of interventions to sort of predict whether or not a merger will raise prices or not. That seems to be like a really good use of computational tools. But when we're asking about the ultimately moral question of whether an individual should be liable for breaking the law, I don't know that computational tools will get us very far in making those judgments. And even if there is some public demand for better detection devices, and again, I think that computational tools, algorithmic tools, can be very helpful in helping us to detect whether or not something probably happened. Ultimately, at the end of the day, criminal law, as opposed to civil law, in some civil law as well, but certainly criminal law, is very attuned to questions of moral judgment. And I don't think we're anywhere near the place that machines can help us make those moral judgments. And I personally, I don't think we should want machines to make those kinds of moral judgments. So I know no one's suggesting that we entirely replace the jury or the judge with a machine to figure out whether someone goes to jail for price fixing or not. But I do think when we talk about criminal law especially, that there remains a place for prosecutorial discretion, for the role of a trier of fact, whether a judge or a jury, in determining moral culpability. And I don't ultimately know that computational solutions advance the ball very much on those things.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you also, since our topic today is looking at which research questions do you think are the most pressing in the field of computational antitrust? Maybe we'll start with Michal. Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry for that. There are many, and I think the field is fascinating, and I want to thank Thibault for putting this on our agenda. I think it's fascinating and it's a growing field. So let me give you some thoughts that I had with regard to research questions. I think that one of them, and that relates to what Daniel has just said, with regard to the procedural tools that should be created in order to ensure the acceptance of computational antitrust. And some questions in this regard is, does the decision maker actually need to understand the technology of proving the conduct or proving the effect on competition? And to what degree does he need to understand that? And these questions are much like other AI decisions in other spheres that I'm involved in and I'm writing on right now. I'm writing about synthetic data. But these questions also arise with regard to computational antitrust. Another question that I would ask is, how different is competition law in this respect from other fields? And what can we learn from what has already been done with computational methods from other fields, possibly legal fields, possibly technological fields? Another question would be a study of algorithms by algorithms. Alexandra, it's a bit like what you said before, fighting fire with fire. So here, it would be interesting to learn how the dynamics of algorithms interacting among themselves would be different from the interaction of humans among themselves, or humans with some with algorithms and some without. So where algorithms are part of the mix, or even are widely used by firms to make strategic decisions, these questions would be relevant, and they might change some of the assumptions that we make with regard to certain types of conduct or with regard to certain conditions in the market. And a final one here is a study of market dynamics in the sense of how firms would react to the use of computational antitrust. Will they stop using certain words, for example, if we have if we're using LLPs, LLMs, large language models, would they simply use other words in order to indicate the same type of conduct? We also saw from the work of DeepMind, Google's DeepMind, that algorithms can learn to encrypt by themselves. So are we going to see more of that? Are there going to be other types of conduct that algorithms might use? So it's it's a mouse and cat game here. And computational antitrust can assist us in analyzing this as well.
Thank you. Jonathan, would you like to what Michal said and also add?
Yeah, I'll tell you my concern. Right now, we've got a stock market that's run amok. It's way too complicated for any individual, any groups of individuals to understand because it's been programmatized. We've got global derivative markets that have run amok and quite likely will collapse and bring down the world economy because it's too complicated for any individual or any group of individuals to understand because of the algorithms. I think we've got to figure out how to take some baby steps in the near term to make it all digestible, especially to lawyers and policymakers. When I was a policymaker, now that I'm a lawyer, here's what I see going on is the technologists, the folks from big industry coming in, just astounding us with visions and with stuff that we can't comprehend, and we let them reach into our pocket and write the rules for us. That can't play out anymore. Now we've got AI's run amok. I mean, the cat's out of the bag. We've got Pandora's box. AI is going to happen. It's inevitable. Whether it happens first in America, whether it happens somewhere else, the problem is it's going to happen. It's going to be adopted certainly by the most nefarious actors. So that's what we've got to watch out for. How do you ensure that AI adopted by the most nefarious actors can be kept under control by those with, at least in the near term, more noble visions of AI? I've tried, look, I've tried in different iterations for the past 15 years to create what I call essentially legal simulators. A way to this, we were calling it the simulacra, a way to figure out if we wrote a law this way, how does that ripple into the future? What will the world look like in 5, 10, 20 years down the line if the law was written this way? We've tried that in various hackathons. Can we crowdsource that concept? It always ends up devolving into something pretty pedestrian. But I think with AI as a partner and humans as a check on the AI, we can run these vast simulations. I know that folks at the MIT Media Lab have been running simulators. Can we do it in a policy legal context? That's what I'd like to see. Fewer articles, more simulations, if we could do that. Also, the other problem is we've got a global context. We're going to be overrun by the most nefarious actors. How can we put the reins on it? What has worked historically? Has industry been able to come together in other contexts to create memorandum of understanding or global treaties? And it's unclear whether or not this has come from government, come from business, come from individuals, or some combination of all those. We're going to see an increasing battle between the nation state and the corporate feudal system and the quest for self-sovereign autonomy. Those are sort of the three pillars. How do we bring them together to create something that will work for everyone? And if not, which of those three pillars ultimately prevails?
And what's in your opinion? How would you react to Jonathan's opinion? And what's the most pressing thing in the field of computational antitrust?
Sorry, was that for Bill or for me?
That sounded hard, Dan.
I think
it's for you.
Okay, my internet glitched for a minute there. So I guess I think that I mentioned this before, but a big payoff would be if we could come up with algorithmic tools to simulate mergers with a high degree of predictability. So I think again, the distinctive thing about mergers is that we typically have quite a bit of data, and we're making predictions, and we're often just not sure how good our predictions are, and courts are struggling with figuring out how good those predictions are. So, you know, look, we have simulation tools now, and people are talking about using algorithms and machine learning to make those more robust. I mean, I think if you could really develop this, or develop a series of these so that you could cross-check them against each other and start seeing consistent results, particularly if you could prove it based on past outcomes, that they predicted things correctly. I think that would actually be a really beneficial tool of merger review. And whether you're looking about at consumer prices or labor prices, which is obviously a big topic of conversation today, you could specify it to give you whatever outcome you're interested in. But I think that could be something that would be really helpful to antitrust enforcement.
We discussed the merger simulations yesterday, so it was a very interesting discussion. It holds a promise also for past merger reviews. And Bill, how about you? What's in your opinion the most pressing research questions?
I like the simulation possibilities a great deal. Again, in the defense world, wargaming is simulation, and the essence of a good simulation is in many ways realism, and the realism comes from building in the best body of information you have about what's happened in the past. To sit in an aircraft simulator, state of the art now, is to be overwhelmed. They mimic the movement of the plane as well, not just the displays on the screen. What makes the teaching powerful is that you have a very vivid sensation of what it's going to be like, so that if you spend enough time in the simulator, they can put you in the cockpit of a 787 or an A350, and you can fly the plane because of everything you've done. But it means that the simulation has to be realistic, which means building in a lot from what you've learned from the past about what you've done. And I think in some ways this requires you to go through the exercise of looking back at the evolution of different regulatory schemes in the past. You know, if you're going to do the hackathon that Jonathan was referring to look at, I write the statute or I write the regulation, what happens in the future, I need to have a pretty good appreciation of what's happened in the past when you do these things. That's got to be built into the model, and that requires an understanding of past experience. You might want to have something that could be called a competition law or regulatory policy biography for individual sectors. Some people have written these to some extent, but the question that would be posed in the biographical exercise is, how did competition law intervention or non-intervention or regulatory intervention affect the way this industry turned out? And what does that tell us about what we might do in the future? I think a parallel area of research is to focus on technology itself. You know, one question that one might have posed to Scott or to the technologists when they come in and talk about gee whiz stuff is, what are the unintended consequences? For all of the instances in the past in which we have deployed high-tech systems and pressed ahead rapidly with exploring new possibilities, doing things because you could do them, what did we learn from that? Whether it was civilian nuclear power, whether it was other technologies that we tried out because we could do it, to what extent have we taken account of the sorcerer's apprentice possibility, that we lose the ability to manage these things effectively, and that we go about taking account of things that could go wrong based on other things that have gone wrong that we know in the past. So that's got to be built in from the technology side into the simulator. And the last thing is I'd really like to see how things turn out with the CMA in the UK, because they're doing the kinds of things we were talking about. They're trying to have people in the room who are not going to be bamboozled by people coming in and overwhelming them with stories about the intricacy of the technology, the kind of research program. I'm keen on seeing how that prototype turns out for policymaking over time.
So what would you say would be a good measurement of their computational effort? Let's say how to measure a computational success in 5 years from now.
I guess the starting point for me would be to say, are you doing some of these things to increase your capacity to do this kind of work effectively? So how have the insights affected the way you staff inside, the way you work with institutions on the outside? A very practical measure is, are you doing Jonathan's hackathon public policy equivalent? Are you doing that? Have you had exercises? And by the way, regulators in different settings, even antitrust authorities have done this, have had equivalents of this, where you're trying to think in a very creative way about what the alternative futures might be, and to intensively address that. So I'd like to ask how many agencies are investing in this, either on their own or in collaboration with other institutions. I realize in some ways I'm focusing on inputs rather than outputs, but I'd at least like to measure whether or not we are seeing efforts to invest in more inputs that might lead us on this path. And I'd also, there are outputs I'd like to assess. The investment that's being now in a promising way in a number of jurisdictions to look at how you can make the public procurement system more impervious to outright corruption or to collusion, and to assemble databases, analyze them to understand what's taking place in procurement. Most of all, because government spends so much money, we're spending so much now. If you move the needle even a small distance, you've conferred enormous benefits on society as a whole. So I'd like to see how that's working out.
Thank you. I can see that Jonathan wants to react, so I'm just going to give him the floor.
Yeah, I just want to say, I love being at a conference with pure academics. I am not a pure academic. I'm a professor of clinical law. Part of me hates the fact that there's so much brilliance and so much energy and so many hours devoted to writing articles that end up in the vortex and in this academic community. I always try to write with a public purpose. So I don't really write law review articles. I was writing a law review article on ad tech, programmatic advertising, and how essentially the programmatic, we're all captive, both the publishers and the brands are all captive to this absurd algorithm that no one understands. I realize it works better as a petition to the Federal Trade Commission. So that's what I'm going to do. I may publish this as an article. In fact, I'd love to publish it with the the Stanford Computational Antitrust Journal. But first and foremost, I want to present it to the FTC. I would love it if folks in this community thought about all of their papers with a public purpose. That's how we get out of our own echo chamber.
I can see that Bill has a reaction to that. So please, Bill.
Some of us have actually spent a bit of time trying to do this in practice. And I think a challenge, Jonathan, is you write your petition, and if there's no effective mechanism internally in the agency to do something useful about it, you might as well be talking to the wall. So I agree that there is the question of how should we try to see theory meet practice? And I agree with you completely that that is a crucial distance to cover to do that and do it effectively. But my other concern is that if the institutions you are talking to, and I suspect you saw this at the FCC, if they are not in a position to take account of what you have to say and deliver on it effectively, it's an exercise that ends up being very disappointing. So thus the the fascination about getting the right vehicle to do the job when the academics are talking to it. And I think a lot of us, because we spent time in that domain, we are not keen on just writing things to the community we're part of. And I think a good thing you see in lots of competition agencies and other regulators is they have lots of academics in the house trying to make those kinds of contributions. I'm not claiming success, but I'm a little more sanguine about the possibility that the academy is attentive to this.
Thank you. So the objective of our project to bridge the gap between the practitioner side and the academic. Maybe just 1 minute each for Daniel and for Michal for their final remark. Unfortunately, the time is up, so just 1 minute, please.
Okay, so just a few thoughts here, and I completely agree with what has been said up to now. I think that if we are looking to measure the success of computational antitrust in 5 years from now, we can look at the different levels. So one of them might be the development of better tools of relatively general use in the field. And then we can look at the use and how many cases actually started because of computational antitrust, how many used computational antitrust in order to base the finding. And then there's the acceptance. I think that the acceptance is going to be an important one. I mean, is there an increase in successful enforcement of complex cases which use computational antitrust, and also acceptance of such tools by decision makers, such as courts? That might be another way of measuring this. And just tying back to some things that both Bill and Jonathan have said. Another measure, I think, might be looking at what you might call transfer learning, which is cross-jurisdictional sharing of such tools and of the learning from using such tools. That might increase the effects of the CMA and other competition authorities which have such tools.
So I would just add that I think that if computational tools are going to become important in antitrust work, that in some ways it has to start with training of law students. Bill said before that most law students don't have any proficiency in mathematics, and I found that to be true. Just trying to teach the Herfindahl-Hirschman index and seeing students looking panicky about the fact this is math. But I really think that most law schools do not sufficiently train students on the technologies of law and the emerging technologies of law, whether it's antitrust or any other field. And I just think that going forward, there's, proficient lawyers and people working for government or in-house are not going to be good at their jobs unless they are comfortable using algorithmic tools to do their job. And that doesn't just happen spontaneously on the job. That sort of requires a level of training that I don't think at least American law schools are by and large giving their students. Maybe I'm sure Jonathan is doing a great job at Brooklyn doing that, but I think that we across the board of legal education, we need to be doing that more consciously and consistently.